Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast.
That's the core of the knowledge work dilemma, is we're focusing on visible activity in the moment as opposed to quality accomplishment over time. From that fatal mistake comes like almost everything negative about the current knowledge work experience. If you're producing stuff that's valuable, not only does that give you security, it begins to give you leverage to slow down your definition of productivity. Because the more you can point towards, I do this and I do this really well. But that's also why I'm not just sending emails all day in a bunch of meetings. Hold me accountable for this. But in exchange for that accountability, you got to give me more autonomy. That's a fundamental exchange of trying to negotiate for a more sustainable, slower definition of productivity.
That's Cal Newport. He's a professor of computer science at Georgetown University and a founding member of the Center for Digital Ethics. He's best known for his best-selling books, including Deep Work and Digital Minimalism. And his latest book is called Slow Productivity. So you'll learn 1, why we're measuring productivity all wrong, the surprising math showing how doing less means achieving more, and 3, the trick to eliminating tasks that don't serve you. I'm Pete Mockaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Cal. Cal, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to chat.
Oh, I have been loving your book, Slow Productivity, and I would like it if you could kick us off with any particularly strikingly, fascinatingly counterintuitive discoveries you made while putting this one together.
The importance of doing fewer things is something that I think proved to be a pretty rich vein. So I have this principle that's in the book. It's one of the 3 principles of slow productivity is do fewer things. And when most people encounter that for the first time, what they think I'm probably saying is like, look, it's stressful to do a lot of things. You need to go easy on yourself. Stop trying to be so productive. Like do fewer things and you're just going to be happier. But that it's a sacrifice. You're going to produce less, but you need to because it's for your own sanity and psychological health. As I really looked into this, though, like one of the big surprises is, oh, wait a second, doing too many things is like this endemic productivity poison. Like it's not just making people miserable, it's an incredibly terrible strategy for trying to produce valuable stuff with your brain. And when you commit to doing fewer things, it doesn't actually lead you to accomplish fewer things. These are somehow separate. And this was a pretty exciting discovery because I was ready for it to be like, look, we got to just reconfigure what we think a reasonable amount of work is. And this ended up to be one of these sort of win-win situations. Working on fewer things at once not only makes your life much more sustainable, you're going to produce more. Over the long term, you're producing more. You're finishing stuff faster. You're producing better work. Like you'll actually be better at your job in any sort of observable, measurable way if you're doing fewer things right now.
So doing fewer things in a zone of time, like a week or a month, results in more total things done over a longer arc of a year plus.
Yeah. So here's the math on that. And really, let's think about doing fewer things at once, like concurrently. What is my count of commitments that I'm actively working on? That's the number I want to reduce. Here's the math of why this leads to more accomplishment, is that in knowledge work in particular, when you agree to a commitment, especially if it's a non-trivial size thing like a project, it brings with it administrative overhead. I have to send and receive emails about this project. I have to attend meetings, about this project. Like, so everything you say yes to has administrative overhead that is necessary to support the work, but it's not the actual work itself. So what happens is when you've said yes to too many things, the quantity of administrative overhead goes past a threshold where it's really sustainable. And now what you have is a lot of your day is now dedicated to talking about projects, like to talking to the collaborators, having meetings, sending emails. And these are fragmenting your day as well. So it's not just like, let's do our administrative overhead hour this morning and then get to work. No. These emails and meetings are spread out throughout your day, which means you really never have any ability to give something a long period of uninterrupted time to really give it your full concentration. So now you have a fragmented schedule, a small fraction of which can actually be spent working with real concentration on the actual projects. The rate at which you're finishing things goes down. And so by having, let's say, 10 things on your plate at once, the rate at which you're finishing things is very slow. Like most of what you're doing is being in meetings and sending email. If you instead had 3 things on your plate, you're going to actually finish those 3 things real fast because you have huge swaths of your day to actually work on them. And what happens after you finish one of these 3 things? You can bring another thing on. And so if you work through this scenario, how long will it take me to finish 10 things if I work on them all at once versus if I just do 3 of them at a time? That second scenario, it's going to take much less overall time to get through those 10 things than the first. And it seems counterintuitive. We're used to thinking of ourselves like a computer or a robot. This thing takes this much time. That's just it. 10 things takes 10 units of time. That's just it. But it's not like that. The overhead matters. So doing fewer things at once actually moves things through faster and at a higher level of quality.
That's beautiful. And not only that, so there's the administrative overhead situation, fragmenting our time. And there's also the psychological factor of, oh, hey, I made some great progress today. Or, oh, hey, celebrate. That whole thing is done. Feel good. And then there's just the market responding. I remember when I was landlording, if I had a unit that was almost ready to go, it did not produce rent. It's like, oh no, it's really close. Like I could maybe have someone come tour and say, now just imagine this, and this will be different when you move in. And that didn't really work for him in terms of like, yeah, no, I'm ready to go with another option because that place already looks done and beautiful. And maybe I can imagine what it would look like done, but it's not done now and it's not visually appealing. That's why they stage homes, all that stuff. So there's benefits on numerous dimensions psychologically, and then starting to reap the rewards of what you have sown.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important to remember busyness doesn't create revenue, right? So just like you don't get rent for the days you spent painting and working on like a unit you own, like you have to do that stuff, but it generates no money. And if you spend more time painting and spend more time rearranging, it doesn't generate more money. You have to actually rent it. The same thing is true in knowledge work. Emailing about a project doesn't generate revenue. Attending a meeting about the project doesn't give you revenue. Finishing the project does. And so like what we should care about is how quickly am I completing projects? How good are they? Because that's what actually generates revenue. But in knowledge work, more so than in like renting buildings, it's also obfuscated and complicated because, well, I was working on this, but also this, and I have 7 different things I kind of do, and other people are involved, and no one really knows what I did. In that obfuscation, we get a lot of the problems with modern knowledge work because it's hard to just say, you produced 9 this year, and last year you produced 6, and you're doing better. Because it's hard to say that, we tend to fall back on what I call pseudo-productivity, which is, well, let me just focus on this high granularity activity that's highly visible. Emails, meetings, I just see you doing stuff, and so I assume you're productive. That's the core of the knowledge work dilemma, is we're focusing on visible activity in the moment as opposed to quality accomplishment over time. From that fatal mistake comes like almost everything negative about the current knowledge work experience.
Cal, this is beautifully articulated. Thank you. And, we love actionable wisdom here, but let's go meta and slow down and say, I would love for you to take us through that whole of history, philosophy, perspective, principles on this very concept of pseudo-productivity, knowledge work, and how we have found ourselves in this current state that is kind of jacked up.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It's what the first part of my book delves completely into, is just understanding how we got where we are. Because this is, by the way, just as an aside, it's a big part of my approach, is because I'm also a professor and a founding member of the Center for Digital Ethics at Georgetown. I think a lot about culture, society, and technology and their interactions from this sort of remove of how do these systems work. I think the systems matter. And there's a fascinating story when we look at what's happening in knowledge work that spans from basically Adam Smith to Slack, right? Okay, so here's what we get. Before knowledge work emerges as a major economic sector, which is really the mid-20th century, right? The term knowledge work is coined in 1959. Before that occurred, we had a pretty good handle on what we meant by productivity. Like it was an economic concept that we could measure pretty accurately within specific organizations. It goes all the way back to Adam Smith. So we first get good with measuring productivity in agriculture. And it's a ratio. How many bushels of wheat do I produce per acres of land I have under cultivation? It's a single number. And we also had in agriculture well-defined production systems. Here is how I rotate my crops. If I change how I do this and that number goes up, then I say, oh, this is a more productive way of doing it. And so what we get here is sort of rapid innovation in cultivation of crops and planting systems, because we have a number we can track. Okay, we go to mills and factories. We could do the same thing. Now I'm going to measure how many Model Ts are we producing per labor hour I'm paying for. And that's a number. And we have a very clearly defined production system. And if I change something in that, we can see if that number improves. And this is what happened with automobile manufacturing. Henry Ford innovates the continuous motion assembly line with interchangeable parts. And that number went up by a factor of 10. They're like, oh, great. This is a much better way to build cars. And this sort of quantitative productivity journey was massively successful. The industrial sector, the wealth created by the industrial sector, grew at a staggering rate from the 1800s into the 1900s. Some economists would say essentially all of the capital on which the modern Western world was built came from the productivity miracle of being able to measure these ratios, adjust systems, see how those numbers got better. Then we get knowledge work. None of this works anymore. Right? Because we're not producing Model Ts and we're not just producing wheat on acres of land. It's a complicated positions where I could be working on a lot of different things. That shifts over time. It's different than what the person right next to me is working on. How we do this work is highly personal, right? There is no production system we can tweak as an organization. Everyone manages their own work and time internally, however they want to do it. So we have no systems to tweak, no numbers to measure. And this was really a big issue because how are we going to manage knowledge workers without these numbers? What we introduced was pseudo-productivity, a crude heuristic that says we can use visible activity as a proxy for useful effort. So if I see you doing stuff, that's better than not. So let's all come to offices where we can have bosses. Let's make sure that like you're working all day. And if we really need to get ahead, let's come in earlier and stay later. We could just increase the window of visible activity, right? So we use this crude heuristic. What happens where this goes awry is when we get to the front office digital IT revolution. So we introduce computers and networks and then mobile computing and ubiquitous internet. And now suddenly you can demonstrate visible activity, the thing that pseudo-productivity demands. You can demonstrate this at a very fine granularity, like sending individual email messages anytime, any place. And this is where pseudo-productivity begins to go off the rails. Once I can be engaged in pseudo-productivity and measured pseudo-productively anywhere and at any time, and it has to be at this really fast, fine-grained granularity where it's not just you saw me in my office during this hour, but how many emails did you send to that hour? How quick were you to reply? How many things are you saying yes or no to? It spun off the rails. And we see this sharp discontinuity. If you study knowledge work, study how people talk about productivity in knowledge work, study how people talk about what's good and bad about knowledge work, you get to the early 2000s, there's a sharp discontinuity where suddenly we become unhappy. Just as email and laptops and then smartphones arrive, we suddenly begin to get much less happy.
Intriguing. And Cal, what is the approximate year when we start seeing that go downhill?
Well, you can see it in survey data, but where I like to look for this is actually in the tone of productivity books, right? Because I'm a collector of business productivity. Look at the business productivity books from the 80s and 90s. Like, what are the big players here? It's like Stephen Covey. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, First Things First, Eat That Frog. These are very optimistic books. Like Stephen Covey's whole thing is if you're careful in identifying what's important to you and what's urgent and what's not urgent, you can figure out what to do with your day with the goal of actualizing all of your deepest desires and dreams as like a human. We're going to self-actualize you. What's the first big business productivity book of the 2000s? David Allen, Getting Things Done.
Oh, that was 2000. Okay.
And if you look at that, the tone is drastically different.
We're overwhelmed. We're drowning. We need help.
Yes. I profiled him for The New Yorker, right? I really went deep on David Allen. It is a nihilistic book. Getting Things Done is like, okay, forget Stephen Covey trying to self-actualize our deepest goals as a human being. What is the goal of getting things done? Can we find a few moments of Zen-like peace amid the chaos of the day?
After your weekly review, you can, Cal, and then it will pass.
He's trying to reduce work to this agnostic widget polling so that like at least we can find some peace. Like it's a very nihilistic book, but what changed between 1994 and 2003? Email. So we see it. It's just a change. And then what are all the biggest business productivity books at 2010s? We got Essentialism, One Thing, my own book, Deep Work. All of these are books that are about how do we push back against the overload? How do we like resist this? How do we find the things that really matter? I mean, it's a complete tone shift where overload, having too much to do, being stressed out becomes the defining feature of knowledge work once we get to the early 2000s. You don't pick that up at all in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, and the 60s. So it's the technology had this huge discontinuity in our experience of this sector.
Okay. Understood. And so then when it comes to the measurement has broken down, what is to be done there in terms of, I think in your book you said we've tried some really stupid things, like how many lines of code have you written, or how many words have you produced? And it's sort of like, well, I mean, were those lines of code brilliantly efficient? Were those words like tremendously insightful, or were they kind of like bloated and lame and blah? So it's like those might have a purpose, kind of, if I can strain them with a quality paired metric as well. It's a real tricky beast, Cal. What is to be done here?
Yeah, well, as long as you're in the pseudo productivity mindset, all the solutions are going to be like that. It's going to be, if activity is what matters, my biggest concern if I'm a manager is you're taking breaks from activities. So I want to make sure, like, what was the big concern of managers about remote work? Is like, well, what if there's periods of the day in which the person is not like doing things? That's taken away the bottom line, because we imagine knowledge workers like they're on an assembly line. Hey, if you stop putting the steering wheels on the Model T for an hour, we can't produce Model Ts for an hour, right? It's just like very direct. So what is the solution? We have to move away from this activity-based notion of productivity towards something that's more outcome-based. And that allows for a much slower definition of productivity that has a lot more variation, a lot more idiosyncrasies, and is a lot more sustainable and meaningful for the people involved.
All right. Can you give us some cool examples or stories or metrics or numbers we might use when we talk about outcome-based? I'm thinking in some fields, it seems pretty straightforward, like sales. Like, okay, there's revenue or gross profit generated from the sales that you've made. And that could look very different in terms of you were cultivating a relationship with a multi-million-dollar account for months or years, and you landed it. And we can measure that in terms of it. And it's you hustling with your cold calling and your cold emailing to get dozens of smaller clients. So there's one outcome.
Yeah. And sales is an interesting example, because I just met a salesman from a big tech company at a book event talking about slow productivity. And you know what he said? He said, look, in our company, because sales is clear, unlike almost every other knowledge work, there's you have these metrics, like what did you bring in, right? And so it's an interesting natural experiment. If we take a knowledge worker where there is a clear metric of success, do we see a drift away from pseudo productivity? And we do. This is what the salesman told me. He said, yeah, in our company, the sales staff doesn't have to go to meetings. Everyone else does. Everyone else, if someone you got to go to meetings, if someone invites you, whatever, everyone in these more ambiguous jobs, yes, but the sales staff, all meetings are optional. Because they have this number and they want that number to be better. And the sales staff is like, that number is worse if I'm going to meetings, right?
That's right. What you do is so important. We're not even going to put that at risk for anything. Please go forth and... Yeah.
Which shows how important were those meetings in the first place, right? Another place where we've seen innovation like this actually is in software development, because software development, it's knowledge work in the sense that it's all your brain, but it's pretty closely aligned with industrial manufacturing because you're producing products. So there's much more of this notion of like, we're shipping something, how long did it take to ship? It's more measurable than other types of knowledge work. We've seen tons of innovation in software development to try to get away from just this completely generic activity base, because they learn, like, I don't care if you're busy. What I care about is, do we get these features added quickly? What's our turnaround cycle on updates to the software? Like, they have things to measure. So what do you see in software development? You see a move towards these agile methodologies where workload management is transparent and centralized. It's not just, I have a bunch of junk on my plate. It's it's all on the wall. And this is what you're working on. And it's just this one thing. You see things like sprinting in software development. We want you to do nothing but work on this feature until it's done. And then we'll talk to you again tomorrow. Because again, whenever we began to see adjacency to actual measurable outcome, all of these tropes of pseudo productivity that are really killing us in digital age knowledge work, they all begin to shatter and fall away. So it's like we have to take that mindset from sales and software development, and we need to move this into more types of jobs, right? But be clear about the workload management, work on fewer things at a time. Just measuring performance at the scale of the year makes a big difference. What did you produce this year? Because when you're talking at the scale of the year, you don't talk about meetings or emails or small things you did. You talk about things you finished. So just having like an annual perspective for thinking about productivity, that makes a difference, right? So all of these types of things, we see it in software, we see it in sales. We need to move that to many more jobs.
I like that a lot. The thought associated with what is the time horizon we're looking at. Because if it is a day and I'm looking at how many emails did you send or how many hours were you logged on, it's like that tells me very little. That could tell me a whole lot. And then I guess in a way, there's some art and science right there in terms of evaluating what's the ideal period by which we should be looking at and thinking about these things. Do you have some perspectives there?
Well, I mean, even allowing people to figure this out on their own can be really effective. Like you say, okay, I want you just to like make your pitch to me as your boss, like what you did that was valuable this last quarter or this last year. Like you can kind of figure out the time frame when you write about it, just allowing the individual to report like, okay, here's what I've been working on. I completed this, and we're working on this big project and we made this much progress on it. And I think this is all really important. Letting someone just describe why they're valuable, because it's not going to work if I ask you to describe why you're valuable. And you said, look, I just looked up my statistics. I've been sending 150 emails a day. I've been logging 7 hours a day in Teams meetings, right? I've been in a lot of meetings. Like it sounds absurd when someone's asking, quantify why you're valuable. You think about the big things. You think about it at a bigger time scale. You know, there are organizations that do this super explicitly. I profiled these in the New Yorker a few years ago. These organizations that had a very hardcore way of doing this called ROWE, Results Only Workplace Environment, where it was all that matters is results, including like when you show up to work, when you don't, what days you work, when everything is up to you. But they're really, in these environments, they're really hardcore about what are your results. And because of this, it really banishes pseudo-productivity culture, right? If you're like, hey, come to all my meetings, you're like, no, because in the end, I'm going to be measured by these things I'm producing, and that's going to hurt me. So no, you got to convince me to come to your meeting. And if it's not going to be worth the time, I'm not going to do it, because all people care about is what I produce. And they're really interesting to study, because you see as on the positive side, these hardcore results only environments, a lot of pseudo productivity falls away. On the negative side, it is really difficult for a lot of people to leave the comfort blanket of all the obfuscation you could generate by just sending lots of emails and meetings, because you can't hide anymore. You produce or you don't. And there is, I think, a certain segment of knowledge workers, and it should be acknowledged, that do find some comfort or peace in being able to be much more obfuscated about their work. Like, it's not really clear what I'm doing, but I answer my emails a lot, and I'm in a lot of meetings, and I sort of just, I'm around, and there's nothing, so it feels like I'm being productive. When that goes away, it gets exciting for a lot of people, but it gets scary for some people as well.
Yeah, I've heard that in particular about the culture at Netflix, in terms of like, it's exciting and terrifying for this very reason. I think ROWE could also have some potential downsides with regard to collaboration and team camaraderie culture. It's like, I'm out to get my results, period. So get out of my way. So it's pros without the cons. Well, the security blanket, you might feel secure in the moment, but I would venture to say, if you're not clearly creating value in excess of your salary and payroll costs, your security is quite slim come layoff time.
I think that's right. In the good times, where no one needs to be fired, it prevents you from being noticed in a negative light. Like, yeah, I'm not thinking about people. Like, I see them a lot. I'm sure it's fine. I'm not thinking about them. But you're right. When times get tight, all right, now we have to start reducing staff. That's suddenly when people shift their thoughts to not, are you doing something bad, to what good are you bringing? And that's when things get to be dangerous for you. So when times are good, you can just be really active and you're not going to draw any attention. But when times are bad, ultimately people are going to wonder, hey, what do you do? What's the value? Like, what would happen?
Office Space. What would you say you do here?
I would say people, by the way, so my column for the New Yorker during the pandemic was named Office Space, in part because of exactly that reference, that there was a lot of people in the pandemic, especially when they were forced to do all their work from home and they could see like their partners and what their partners were doing for their jobs. And I think a lot of people in knowledge work had that same reaction of like, what would you say I actually do here? Is it I'm a professional Zoom meeting attender? Like, is this really a good use of my graduate degree? I think a lot of people had that crisis. But yeah, back to your point. If you're producing stuff that's valuable, not only does that give you security, it begins to give you leverage to slow down your definition of productivity. Because the more you can point towards, I do this and I do this really well, But that's also why I'm not just sending emails all day in a bunch of meetings. Hold me accountable for this. But in exchange for that accountability, you got to give me more autonomy. That's a fundamental exchange of trying to negotiate for a more sustainable, slower definition of productivity.
That's good. And when it comes to this notion of doing fewer things, you mentioned the book, The One Thing, which I love. And it's so funny when I read it, also with Greg McKeown's Essentialism, it's so to me, and I guess I like productivity books or nonfiction businessy books, but I think it's also just like, oh, I don't have to do everything. Oh, okay, that's nice. So it's just sort of like reassuring. But I'd love your perspective on how do we really select from a noisy world of thousands of options? What are those few things I'm going to do? And the number you suggest, it's probably going to be more than one, but hopefully is less than 5. Is that the range you are shooting for?
Yeah, for major projects, yeah.
And so how do I pick and choose of hundreds of potentially good things? What really, really, really deserves to be in my 1 to 5?
There's 2 environments here. So one is you work for someone. If you're in an organization, what really seems to matter is just add constraints. And then you will see pretty naturally like what makes the cut. So for example, one of the things I recommend if you work within an organization where you can't just directly say no to a lot of things, what you do instead is saying, I'm going to keep a 2-tier list of what I'm working on. Tier 1 is actively working on. Tier 2 is queued up for me to work on next. And as I finish something in the active tier, I pull in the next thing from the waiting tier. And that becomes something I'm actively working on, right? So you artificially constrain the number of things you're actively working on. And the rule is why this works is you say, okay, administrative overhead can exist for the things I'm actively working on. If it's in my queue, then I don't do administrative overhead, right? So if you give me something to do and I put it on my queue and I make this public and you can look at it and it's a shared document, you can watch it. I can tell you, watch this march up my queue until it gets to my active work tier. Once it's there, email me about it. We can have meetings about it. You can ask me how it's going. But until it's there, the answer is I'm not working on it yet. And where is it in my list? You can look at it yourself. So now you've restricted the administrative overhead that's being generated to only a small number of the things that you ultimately have committed to. Once you have those constraints, it leads to better selection. Other people are now involved. So a boss comes in and says, this thing, I want you to do this thing. You say, great, it's on my queue, it's back here. And they're like, no, I need this is way more urgent. Well, now you can involve the boss. Be like, great, well, which of these 3 things that I'm working on now should I swap out? And now they're kind of involved. Like, actually, you know what? Stop working on that thing. I don't think that's as important as I thought it was when we first thought about it. Move this in here instead. And now that I'm looking at your queue, take out these 4 things as well. That's not where the priority is, right? So once you have constraints, you begin to get wisdom. So this is an example from the book, but another place where this began to happen was a division within a large research lab where they had a lot of projects coming at them. And what they did is they centralized this. They said, okay, well, put every project we want to work on an index card, and we're going to put it on the wall under this certain column. These are all things we want to work on. And then here next to it are the ones we're actively working on now, and we label it with who's working on it. And so when someone finishes something, we pull something else in here, and we decide together what to do next. And they have this heuristic that arose over time. If something's been on that left side of the wall for a while, and we keep pulling other things in, but we've been leaving that alone, that's probably not that important. Let's take it down. Like if you're on the wall too long and it never moved over to let's work on it actively next, that was their cue of this was exciting when we thought of it, but it's not that important. So once you have constraints, wisdom about what's important and what's not, it begins to emerge because you're thinking about this in a way that you don't, when all you're doing is just saying yes to things and trying to keep up with everything at the same time.
So if you have the constraints, it's a forcing mechanism such that it's not so much like, oh, there's a magical measurement. There's a magical question or a magical metric by which we use to measure that answers this question for us. It sounds like you're saying, yeah, that doesn't really exist across all industries and types of work, but rather put the constraints in and you'll feel the tension and you'll see what just really, really has to get done soon and what can wait.
Yeah, just being forced to continually make the question of what next forces a lot of wisdom. And, I keep having to say, okay, what am I going to pull in next? What am I going to pull in next? And like making that decision again and again, what emerges from it is like a better understanding of, oh, this is the type of stuff that's like important to me. And this stuff I keep leaving over here and moving other stuff ahead. Oh, I guess that's not really that important to me. And it's a lesson that comes out from people who use these 2-tier pull systems. It's something they talk about often. You build up the muscle of understanding over time what matters and what doesn't, because you keep making these decisions and keep getting feedback on what stays and what moves. And then over time, you stop adding the stuff to the work on next list that like that's never going to be pulled off. And then you become much better at being like, no, we don't do that anymore. Because you're like, I've seen too many things like that type of project that we put on this list or we put on the wall and it sits there for 2 months and we finally take it down. I have now learned, I've gained wisdom. This is not the type of thing that we really need to be working on. So you become much more self-aware of what you can actually do with your limited time and what's worth doing with your limited time when you're explicitly and consciously having to make these decisions again and again.
And when you say explicitly and consciously, that reminds me of some of the interviews we've had about decision-making with Annie Duke and others who suggest having a decision journal. And I think the practice perhaps of writing out what is the rationale by which I'm using to place this in the top tier or not. And then having that written enables you to kind of reflect on it and say, oh yeah, well, that was true at the time, but or yes, this is the pattern I see over and over and over again. Like, it's really important to a really big client. Okay, that seems to be a prioritization principle that we keep going back to again and again.
I love that technique, by the way. Yeah, I know Annie talks about it. My friend Dave Epstein, from Range and the sports team, he was on the show recently and he was telling me about how he does this as well. And part of the reason why I think this technique, like a decision journal, is effective in knowledge work is that we don't otherwise have clearly defined processes. One of the defining features of knowledge work is that organizational strategies, processes, how I figure out what to work on or not, how I figure out how to manage my day, all of this is informal and personal. And most people just wing it. It's like, oh my God, I just got this urgent email, so let me do this. And oh, there's a deadline, I'm going to stay up and do this. When you keep a decision journal, what you're actually creating over time is process. You're like, oh, like this is how I deal with this. This is the right way to figure out what to work on next. We forget the degree to which in knowledge work, we just wing it all the time. It's not like we have, here's how I build cars. How do I improve that? It's the equivalent in knowledge work if the way we built cars was just put a bunch of tools and parts in a warehouse, threw a bunch of engineers in there, like, guys, build me some cars, let's go. And everyone was just like running around and like, hey, can I have the wrench? And that's the way we do knowledge work. So like if in that world, you're starting to actually think, how do I figure out what to work on? What didn't work? What did work? You start to think about that clearly. It's like the one-eyed man in the world of blind people. You're going to have this huge advantage. Like, oh my God, why are people working so hard? Like I'm really killing it over here and I'm not even working because no one else is doing this. They're just getting after it with Slack and email in their calendar and just saying yes to everything and trying to be busy. So there's a huge advantage once you start thinking process-centric within knowledge work.
That's to the one thing that is one of my favorite questions I think about often. What's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? And I think that is one handy question. I've learned it's not applicable in all situations, in all domains. But I'm curious, have you discovered any other organizing principles or questions that tend to serve people pretty well, pretty often?
Well, I mean, first, just as an aside, have you heard Jeff Bezos's version of the one thing idea?
You articulate it. Lay it on me. This
is like the big idea within Amazon when trying to figure out what are we going to work on and what are we not going to work on, is Bezos has this thing, is this something that's going to make our beer taste better? And if it's not something that makes our beer taste better, we shouldn't be in that business. And the case study he's referring to was when, I guess, German brewers, beer brewers, used to generate their own electricity. And then at some point, they plugged into a grid instead of generating their own electricity. There's a lot of annoyance and logistical overhead with running your own generators and dynamos.
Yeah, sounds tricky.
Right. It's tricky, right? And they said, oh, we should just plug into the grid. Why? Because making our own electricity doesn't make our beer taste better. So let's not put any energy into that. We want all of the people we hire to have their energy into making our beer taste better. And so Bezos brought that over to Amazon. We should be focusing on the things that makes us money, that like our customers really care about. Anything else, if we can outsource it, we should, or just not do it at all. And so I really love that way, like what makes our beer taste better. But that brings me to, I think, back to your question. One of the other big principles is obsess over quality. And what this is really doing is basically in knowledge work, in some sense, figuring out like what's your equivalent of brewing beer. Figuring out me as an individual employee, what's the thing I do that's most valuable? And if there's nothing really there that's valuable, what's something I can learn to do that's going to be really valuable? And once you identify that, you can focus more of your energy. And my goal is not to be really responsive. My goal is not to make sure that everyone gets everything they need from me as fast as possible. My goal is not to be in every meeting where you need me. No, my goal is to do this thing better. I want to do this better and better because this bottom line helps our organization. And one of the keys behind this idea is focusing on something that's really valuable to your company or your organization is like the foundation on which all radical engagements with slow productivity will eventually be built because it gives you leverage. It gives you control over your job. It makes your value clear. You're playing the right game. It allows you to focus on what matters and not these sort of accessibility routines that everyone else is trying to do with their email and with their meetings. And when you really begin to care on making your beer taste better, all of the busyness becomes unnatural to you. So you say, I don't want to be on email or in meetings. That's getting in the way of getting better at these marketing strategies or at writing this code. And so slowness becomes natural. And as you get better, you get more leverage to make your work slower. So that idea, figure out like what your equivalent is of brewing beer. What's the thing you do best and focus on that. That unlocks almost everything else.
That's cool. So if I'm doing marketing, what's giving me more impressions per dollar or more purchases per whatever, but what's boosting my conversion rate, etc. Or if you're creating products, it's like the beer tastes better. What will delight the customer all the more and make rocks? I love their stuff. I'm going to tell more people about their stuff. I'm going to buy more of their stuff. Very cool. All right. Well, so we've talked about, so we got 3 principles here. We've spent some good time on do fewer things, and we hit the obsess over quality. Can you unpack the third one for us a bit?
That's work at a natural pace. And the argument here, this is a psychological argument. The way that we work in knowledge work, which is all out all day long, year round, is really unnatural. It's unnatural in a sort of literal sense that human beings throughout our whole history as a species are used to having huge variation in intensity of what we're doing. There's really intense periods during the day and really quiet periods. Some months are much more intense than other months, right? In the winter, we're kind of hunkering down, and in the fall, we're doing the harvest and it's super busy, and we have all this variation. That's what we're wired for. And then we got mills and factories. And in mills and factories, it made more money if people just worked as hard as they could, as much as they could. And so we switched for the first time in human history to just like work hard all day long, but it was very unnatural and very intolerable. And we had to invent labor unions and regulatory frameworks just to try to make these jobs survivable, essentially. When knowledge work emerged in the mid-20th century, we said, okay, how are we going to organize this labor? And we said, well, let's just do the factory thing. Because that's what was going on. That's what was in the air. The core of the economy was industrial manufacturing. So it's like, great, we'll just approach knowledge work like we do building Model Ts. 8-hour days, work as hard as you can. Like if you're resting it all during the day, that's bad. Pseudo-productivity, activity matters, and it's the same all year round, right? So we adopted this way of working that was actually super unnatural and required all these safety mechanisms. We adopted the same thing without the safety mechanisms, and it's an exhausting way to work. It doesn't, over time, produce more productive effort, even if in the moment it seems more satisfyingly frenetic. So work at a natural pace says you need more variation in your intensity on all sorts of timescales. It shouldn't all just be all out. It also says you should take longer to work on your projects, that we make our timelines too small. Give yourself more time so that you have room for these up and down variations. Like this is the way all of the great thinkers through time past worked, up and down in intensity over time until eventually something good came out. That's how we produce things with our brain, not the Model T model of just clock in and turn that wrench as fast as you can until you clock out.
Okay. Well, so then any sense for how do we tune in to knowing we're overall too much or overall too little? I know there's going to be variability, busy seasons, lighter seasons. Any clues that we might focus in on to go, ooh, let's crank it up or let's tone it down?
Well, that's not the hard part. The hard part for people actually is just being comfortable with the idea that you shouldn't always be cranked up. And then once you have that realization, there's a lot more variation that just becomes natural. So like a couple things you can do. One, just start doubling your timelines for everything you agree to do. Instead of doing the typical trick of, in theory, what's the fastest possible time I could get this done? And then falling in love with that timeline. Oh my God, that'd be great. If I could get this done before Christmas, like this would be great. And then we commit to this impossible timeline, double everything. So give yourself much more breathing room. And 2, like actually engineer seasonality. You don't have to tell people about this if you work for someone else, but just schedule out your project so that like the summer's going to be slower, but you're really going to be like getting after it in November. Like you can just start engineering variations in your workload. No one is tracking your workload so carefully. There's no graph somewhere in the central office. You're like, I'm looking at Pete's daily work project touches here, and they're down in July versus whatever. People, it's all just chaos. They don't know what's going on. So take longer and engineer seasonality explicitly into your project flow and your workflows. Like just doing that is going to be like taking a deep breath.
Lovely. Cal, tell me anything else you really want to make sure to mention before we shift gears and hear about a few of your favorite things.
Well, I mean, again, I think the key thing to keep in mind is don't use the word productivity so confidently. I mean, there's a lot of talk where people are like, I want to be more productive or productivity is bad, but people aren't really defining their terms. That's a big problem. I mean, we all just assume we all know what productivity means, but we don't. Like when people say, I want to be more productive, what they really mean often is like, I want to produce more stuff over time. When people are critiquing productivity, what they're often doing is critiquing a sort of like industrial notion of productivity, you know, like the effort per day needs to be large. We're not talking about the same things. Like, let's define our terms. And this is why I think it's helpful to say, pseudo-productivity is what we're doing. Pseudo-productivity is different than quantitative productivity, which is what we used to do. Slow productivity is itself an alternative. Like once we get clear about terms, a lot of the absurdity of what we're doing just becomes self-evident. A lot of this idea of, I want to do this now instead of that. I'm going to do fewer things. I'm going to have more variation. When we realize like that's in contrast to pseudo-productivity, and that's a part of slow productivity, just having the terms clear, I think really makes it better, much easier for us to make progress. So that's my final thing I would say is don't be too confident that you know what people mean when they use the word productivity. Actually push on it. What specifically are we talking about here?
Cal's about to share his favorite things. And one of my favorite things is our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsor to check out is Storyworth. Whenever I'm thinking about meaningful Father's Day gifts, Storyworth leaps to mind. Storyworth helps you preserve precious memories and stories from your father for years to come. Each week, Storyworth emails your loved ones a thought-provoking question that you get to help pick, such as, what's the bravest thing you've ever done? I personally love the prompt so much that I have refreshed Storyworth's questions page many times looking for more. Storyworth makes the writing process super quick and easy. All your loved one needs to do is respond to that email with a story, and then you get a quick copy of that. And after a year of this fun, Storyworth compiles your loved one's stories and photos into a beautiful keepsake hardcover book that you'll be able to share and revisit for generations to come. Families love Storyworth so much, they've got 25,000 five-star reviews on Trustpilot and have millions of stories preserved. So give all the fathers in your life a unique, heartfelt gift they'll all cherish for years. Storyworth. Right now, you can save $10 on your first purchase when you go to storyworth.com/awesome. That's storyworth.com/awesome to save $10 on your first purchase. And big thanks to our sponsor, Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invests your money for you. NerdWallet.com, whom I love on these sorts of matters, gives Acorns a whopping 4.7 stars and says, quote, if you want to make the most of your spare change, there's no better place to do that than Acorns. Head to acorns.com/awesome or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. And we got a legal disclaimer here. It may not be representative of all clients. Tier 1 compensation provided. Compensation provides an incentive to positively promote Acorns. View important disclosures at acorns.com/awesome. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. Please consider your objectives, risk tolerance, and Acorns' fees before investing. Acorns Advisors LLC, Acorns, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Brokerage services are provided to clients of Acorns by Acorns Securities LLC, member FINRA/SIPC. For more information, visit acorns.com. One sponsor to check out is Harvard Business Review. This brilliant magazine, published at hbr.org, is the leading destination for smart management thinking. Fun fact, HBR has been mentioned in 108 episodes of the show. That's because HBR has great stuff that comes up often. They've got explainer videos, podcasts, real-world case studies, and much more. I think of HBR each night that I put on my special orange glasses. Their article, Will Blue Light Glasses Improve Your Sleep?, revealed that those who wore them reported better sleep and a 7% improvement in work performance as compared to those who wore the sham glasses. So I cite HBR anytime anyone tells me that I look silly wearing them. Now, much of HBR's content is available for free when you sign up at their site. Subscriptions that get you unlimited content cost $10 a month. If you visit hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME, you can save 10% off of that subscription. Again, to save 10% off of your HBR subscription, go to www.hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME. Lovely, thank you. Now could you share a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
Well, there's an obvious answer to this question because I actually wrote a book with this quote in the title. So maybe I'm telegraphing I like this. Steve Martin, doing Charlie Rowe's interview about his memoir, Born Standing Up, right? And Steve Martin says, people are always asking me, how do you succeed in the entertainment industry? And he says, the answer I give them is never what they want to hear. What they want to hear is like, here's how you find a right agent, or here's how you like get onto the writing staff. And he says, no, what I tell them is, be so good they can't ignore you. If you do that, all the other good things will follow. I wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, that was just inspired by that quote because that's how important it is to me. Because I ultimately think, especially in creative work, that's what it all comes down to. Be so good they can't ignore you. The other stuff will work itself out if that's where you're focused.
And a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
This always shifts, but there's a new study someone just showed me, which I found very satisfying because I don't use social media. And I'm often argued with people for various reasons why I should. And one of the reasons they give me is like, well, this is how like you're an academic and like this is how people know about you and know about your work. You have to be yelling at people on Twitter about Trump. And if you're not, like you can't be a successful academic. A new study just came out where they studied the citation count of academics correlated to Twitter engagement and found Twitter engagement does not lead to more citations. It does not lead to more notice to academics' work. What does matter? Doing really good, important work. And so I found that study very satisfying is you're not going to be able to tweet your way into intellectual significance. You just have to do good stuff.
And a favorite book?
A book I just read, which I really liked, was Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath. It's a 1950s era book by a great Jewish theologian talking about the Shabbat. But I found like a lot of secular resonance in this book because he was looking at the theology of Shabbat, taking a day off of work, like as it said in Genesis, right, in the Bible. And he has this really cool argument. I wrote an essay about it, but he has this argument that's like, look, you take a day off from work. This is not instrumental. This is not, you have to take a day off work so that you'll be able to do work better when you get back. He says, not instrumental. You take a day off of work so that you can appreciate all the other stuff in life that's important. In Genesis, it was like God looked at what he had done and said it is good. It's like gratitude and presence. And I just thought it was from 70 years ago, looking at something that was written 3,000 years ago is a really sort of timeless idea that not everything is just the work, and breaks from work is not just about making the work better. It's about all the other stuff that's important too. And it's a slim book. It's beautifully written, has these original woodcut illustrations, which are fantastic. Really cool read. I recommend it.
All right. And a favorite tool, something you use to be awesome at your job?
I recently have gone down the mechanical keyboard rabbit hole. Because I wore off on my MacBook, I wore all the keys off. Because I write a lot and the plastic was cheap in this generation. I wore every key off. You can't see any key. And so I got a cover for it with the keys on it, and I wore all those off too. So I finally bought a Newphy, N-U-P-H-Y, mechanical keyboard. And I love it. Just the click and the clack. It's substantial. I love writing on it. Your fingers spring back up with the key so that like you can type faster. And I don't know, I write all the time. I enjoy writing more on this than I did when I was on just the MacBook keyboard. So I love my Newphy wireless mechanical keyboard.
All righty. And is there a key nugget you share that really seems to connect and resonate with folks? You find it's quoted back to you often?
I think people really, more recently, one of the things to come back to a lot is this idea that activity doesn't matter. Busyness isn't monetizable. Your email inbox is not going to be remembered 10 years from now. But what you produce that you're proud of, that's everything. And just this idea of output over activity, that's what keeps coming back to me. That's what people seem to be quoting when they're talking about this book or calling into my podcast. So I like that. Busyness is maybe satisfying in the moment, but is forgotten in the mist of history.
Okay. And you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Do fewer things. Trust this idea that if you cut down the number of things you're working on right now, you will look back when this year is over and be much more impressed and proud of what actually got accomplished.
Cal, this is fantastic stuff. I wish you much fun and slow productivity.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to go slowly get some things done.
Boy, Cal's take on the quality accomplishment over time being way more important than visible activity at the moment, it seems sort of obvious, like, oh yeah, I knew that, of course, sure. And yet, I found in my own work life that was not the practice that I was engaging. Good consistency. So Cal's actually inspired me. Hey, here we are in April, and this is coming out originally, the beginning of a new quarter. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to set specific goals for this quarter, and then I can feel awesome about advancing toward those, bringing each to completion, and celebrating, hey, look what I did this quarter. Very good. As opposed to a shorter time horizon each day. It's like, ooh, look at all the activities I did this day. It's harder to step back and feel good about I did a thing. Hooray, celebrate, congratulations, sweet victory, bask in it. On the day horizon versus I found the quarter is working for me so far. So really cool stuff from Cal. If you'd like a summary write-up of the actionable wisdom Cal shared, please subscribe to the Gold Nugget email list. You can find that at awesomeatyourjob.com. Or to just read the particular transcript and links to bits we've mentioned here on this episode, you can find that over at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.